Seven, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
You'll never have the sacred stone.
Oh, this you crazy mother.
Welcome everyone. This is Danny Lambert in the Plush Republic channel. This is episode 4. You may have seen the previous one with Chris Rudigrap from Sendoso, and now it is my pleasure to have a good friend and mentor of mine, Ryan Schram, the COO at IZEA. How you doing today, Ryan?
Hey, Danny, thanks so much for having me on tonight.
If you wouldn't mind, can you just introduce yourself and your position, a little bit about IZEA for the people who may not be familiar?
Sure, absolutely. I serve as the Chief Operating Officer, as you mentioned. I joined the company originally in 2011 as the firm's first ever Chief Marketing Officer, and it was elevated to my position about a year and a half later. In my capacity, I oversee everything from our global managed service client development team, our SaaS partnerships team, marketing communications, human capital, you name it, the random cats and dogs, all that stuff in between that is sexy and not sexy, kind of falls into my domain as COO.
Yeah, and we had the pleasure of working together for a handful of years.
You sure did.
Still one of my favorite people to work underneath. I learned some of the best stuff in my career working alongside you. And one of the things that you know probably as well as anybody is the changing landscape that influencer marketing has had. I mean, you guys are in this point where it's influencer and content that you guys do probably better than anybody. But for people who may not be as familiar with the influencer space and are only starting to get a glimpse of that now that it's so popular, can you shed some light on kind of how that's evolved over time and where you see that going over the next couple of years?
Of course. So, I think back to 2006 when IZEA was created. In fact, back then, it was known as payperpost.com. And in full transparency and disclosure, I was not a founder of the company. I came in much later in the story, but I was able to be a front row observer as a friend of our founder and CEO, Ted Murphy. And really, the genesis of the firm back then was it was the heyday of MySpace and LiveJournal. Like, those were the platforms of the day.
Yep.
And there was a need to be able to pay people to post things on their MySpace walls. And Ted realized that trying to identify who those people would be, the kinds of followings they had built on MySpace, making sure that the content was good before they posted it, but still genuine, and then trying to even pay them, doing that all manually was a massive pain in the butt. So it sparked a business idea of what if there was a marketplace that brought together buyers and sellers, a tale as old as time in advertising, but in new social platforms. The company has been the benefactor of just the broader social ecosystem dramatically expanding, as everyone knows. And today, we sit on the largest marketplace in the world that supports paid sponsorships and paid content creation for really creators of all shapes and sizes, from celebrities and athletes all the way down to an everyday influencer, someone who could just as easily be your next door neighbor who's a foodie doing an activation for a major food CPG brand.
Yep. And that begs the question, right, as any double-sided marketplace has, is when you were on those early days, what was it, the chicken or the egg? Did you go client first? Did you go creator first? What was that like?
Well, I think it was actually convincing people there was a chicken because, the reality at first was this seems like something that's unnatural and should not exist. In fact, Ted took a lot of knives in his back in the early days from people who said, the social sphere should be pure. There should be no ads on it. It was like this weird alternative utopia, and lo and behold, now you think of who some of the most powerful advertising players are in the world, and they are largely social platforms or things related to the social sphere.
Yeah.
But when you think about influencer marketing, or what's called today at least influencer marketing, it really comes down to the fact that I think those platforms, those messages, those stories were bound to be democratized. And when we started, it was about gathering up who were those influential people. And influence for us has never been just geometric to audience size, right? I tell people all the time, I am no web celeb, but friends of mine know that if I'm going to talk about good coffee or timepieces or Legos, that I have influence in those spheres of my personal passions and geekdom. I mean, look at these walls. Like there's Jim Henson stuff all over the place, right? It's
No one
just,
knows Legos like you, my friend. If anyone ever
well,
had questions, I would have to point them your direction.
thank you. It's a compliment and a concern, probably, but I appreciate the sentiment. And so, but if you wanted someone to talk about Lego or talk about Muppets, you might want to consider me as an everyday influencer. And if you can rope together hundreds or thousands of me's out there, and you can with proper technology and proper marketplaces, the quote unquote sell side becomes less of a challenge over time. It then talks about how do you get as many valid opportunities, the right fits for the right kind of individual on the demand side as best possible.
Yeah. And this wasn't exactly the direction I was planning on going, but it kind of parlays into a really interesting question I think a lot of people have right out of the gates is you kind of have three pillars, and correct me if I'm wrong if there might be one I'm not including, but you have SaaS, you have managed service, um, and I'm missing one. I think I had it in my notes here. Well, SaaS and managed service are the main two.
Yeah.
And when do you find people choosing a managed service approach, kind of that white glove service over a SaaS offering? Is it at a certain revenue size? Is it a campaign need? Because you guys deal with a lot of brands and agencies, and you must see some sort of trends over when they choose one option over the other.
It's a very common question, and you kind of think about the time horizon of the company when it was paper posts and even the early aspects of what is now IZEA. We had these individual self-service platforms, Social Spark for paid blog posts and sponsored tweets. All of those have now been rolled into IZEA X, the software platform you're referring to. And I think what makes IZEA special and really versatile in today's climate is that we aren't an agency. We can offer a technology backbone to make the process more efficient, whether you want to do it yourself, which is, of course, the SaaS offering, or if you need help. The interesting thing from a use case perspective, though, to answer your question, is the lineage of the company. You look at the last, say, 6 or 8 years, is vast majority of the revenue coming from managed services. That whole time, we were building a platform to make that managed service apparatus as efficient as possible for us internally, because our hypothesis was things that we would need to do to make a campaign beneficial to a brand would be the same things an agency or a brand itself would need to do the same kind of campaign. And when we lit up the ability to do SaaS in 2015, it really opened our eyes to really not be afraid of our primary concern at the time, which was cannibalizing a really good business that we had built in managed service for the benefit of SaaS. Mm-hmm. And what we're finding is, and what we couldn't have expected at the time, was the giant upheaval in the broader advertising ecosystem happening around that same period. The continued fallout of the holding companies from the ad agency perspective having to reorganize, all the way down to the rise of insourcing at brands themselves, combined with the increase of the acceptance of the creator economy and how that can work on a true freelance mentality for brands and agencies, has really changed that game. So where it's resulted is that the very same brand who may license IZEA X and do, say, 3/4 of their executions themselves may actually work with our managed service team for big things coming up, a Super Bowl or an Oscars execution or a big launch, whatever it happens to be. And then the same is true on the other side. We'll have people who do a tremendous amount of managed service business, but they may have a line or a division where they feel like the budgets are too small, and therefore licensing the platform at a reasonable price point and doing it themselves for a line of revenue we would have never had exposure to, benefits that company and of course benefits IZEA.
Yep. That's a very good answer. And I think one of the things that's interesting that a lot of people may not know at a surface level is how you've gotten to where you are today. Because you're obviously mentioned coming from pay per post, and then now you have the largest platform in the world. that's not only inclusive of influencer. I think some people might look at you guys as an influencer software, but not understand what's under the hood. You guys had the eByline acquisition to get I guess that was kind of the first step towards including custom content at a very high editorial level. And then a handful of other acquisitions since, including the very recent FluVip. So what has been your plan? Oh, and Tap Influence. What has been your plan with these series of M&As to structure yourselves for growth, structure yourselves around the right capabilities, and how do you identify who those targets in the market are that complement you the best?
Let me unpack that question as best I possibly can. So on the capabilities front, I've always been a firm believer that the best influencer marketing, advocate marketing, ambassador marketing, whatever you want to call the stuff that happens when a brand pays an individual to create and distribute content, is frankly content marketing itself. And it's the reason why we call all the individuals who register for our platform on the supply side creators. Because you look at an individual who may have a great multi-channel presence on a blog, an Instagram channel, a YouTube channel, that same individual may have the ability to create assets for a brand that they themselves could create at a much higher price point, or just aren't motivated to create because of time horizons or other restraints. So there's now this duality to their value. It's not just having to put it on the channels that they've created. It's the ability to accept them as a true content creator in the traditional sense, right? Things that we may have given to a creative agency 20 years ago, or things that you may have hired a freelance editor to do are now all, in some cases, the same person. Mm-hmm. There's also the awareness for us, and this was really obvious when we started talking to eByline prior to acquiring them in 2015, that there was a whole other sphere of things that were influential that, again, had nothing to do with the distribution side, that there were experts and journalists who were being laid off from very big newsrooms, right? Big newspapers, big magazines, big media companies. And now their expertise and their years of training with that sort of that quintessential big J background can be used to help fill out an entire content hub for a brand and effectively form a virtual newsroom. Yep. So part of our strategy is to really figure out how do we champion that creator economy to the extent that we see it today, but most importantly, look at it from a triple accretive perspective for tomorrow. Mm-hmm. So whether it was, buying eByline, buying Zen Content for their expertise in e-commerce content, buying Tap Influence for the incredible work that they had built on influencer SaaS and SaaS only with a great focus there. We really approached this from the perspective of, can we not only pick up revenue, but truthfully, can we pick up talent and technology? That's what makes it triple accretive in our perspective. And candidly, those transactions are not easy to find or easy to always implement. But I do think they're what ultimately drives the most shareholder value, but also really drives the most value for our customers, which is what matters most to me as the COO of the company. Yep. So as we look to the future and start to think about these things, today we play very much in, like you said, in the managed services space and the SaaS space. I do believe that there's two things on either side of that. I think that there is, truly self-service companies out there and technologies that are in that asset class that could be very interesting. The same on the other end of like very bespoke consulting, not an agency model, but someone who can come in and really craft a cohesive content marketing approach in tandem with other partners, and then perhaps use technologies and services that are inside the IZEA stack to fulfill them, but also perhaps not. So we're going to look to fill out those things, and we're also going to start to use our very unique vehicle, being the only publicly traded company in this space, to approach that on a global basis. So you had mentioned our recent letter of intent to acquire FluVip, which is the largest influencer marketing player in Latin America. That to me is very much the direction by which we're going to go. And I think that it's an opportunity that we feel IZEA is uniquely positioned for to be able to pull off.
And on the topic of globalization, obviously you're going to be the first in the space to attempt something along these lines. How do you approach that, knowing that no one's yet done it, knowing there's a lot of crazy regulation, especially in the EU, that doesn't, I mean, we could just talk about regulation period, not necessarily
Sure.
specific to the EU, because that's a huge topic in the influencer spaces. How do you account for all of that in these decisions, and how do you stay on top of all these regulations? Because they didn't exist. Influencers relatively new compared to everything else out there. How do you stay on top? How do you make sure you're staying compliant?
That's a great question. We started by trying to lead from the front. Back in 2008, Ted Murphy went to the FTC here in the U.S. There were no regulations at the time, and certainly as a result, because there were no federal regulations, there was not even an inkling of any kind of enforcement action by a trade organization or what have you as a result. It was the wild, wild west. And the way we've always felt about this is that, influencer marketing shines the brightest when the right brands are working with the right creators. And when that magic happens and someone is not just a paid shill, which, by the way, consumers can sniff from a mile away, right?
Yep.
Consumers are not dumb.
Yep.
But you'd be surprised at how many times brands think consumers are dumb. When that is done right, the authentic storytelling that comes from that and the resulting engagement over multiple quarters is frankly what makes the industry shine. And at the heart of that is the trust that a creator has with their audience to A, work with brands that they'd be proud to associate themselves with, and B, as a result of that pride, have no problem telling people that they were paid to work with them. And it's no different than if, a favorite timepiece company of mine or Lego came to me and said, "We'd love to have you be an everyday influencer for us, Ryan." I would scream from the hills that they sponsored me, right? Where you see the shame in the industry and frankly the problem is on the fringes. You see it in the sort of D-list celebrity space, all of the diet shakes and crazy supplements that aren't FDA regulated in this country. There's always been a lot of dark money that's gone through those categories. Influencer marketing just happens to be the newest pillar where that dark money is flowing. Mm-hmm. Where you also see it, unfortunately, is not necessarily in D-list celebrities. You do see it in more common day-to-day executions where the creators, frankly, are having to make a living. They don't necessarily believe in the product or service that they're promoting, but they need to make a buck. So they do a sponsored post, and we've seen so many flameouts. Recently, there was an unnamed soda manufacturer of the caffeinated kind that hired a series of working women and to talk about how they drink that beverage to start every single one of their work days. And a number of the women they happened to hire, who I assume were either forced or out of financial need, wanted to take that money, had an entire social footprint around a non-caffeinated, healthy lifestyle, right?
Oh, the irony. That seems really authentic.
Irony, hypocrisy, schadenfreude, whatever you want to call it, it wasn't great. And, the resulting distrust that came from those followers, I don't know what that person got paid, but it wasn't worth the impact on their reputation.
And the brands.
And thankfully, I do believe by and large, people are doing it right. In fact, we commissioned a study that showed that the vast majority of creators are aware and understand the guidelines in both the US and in Canada, where we do the study. But unfortunately, less than a third of marketers are aware and understand. And to that extent, we also asked creators in that same study, how many of you were asked to explicitly not disclose a sponsorship over the last year? And that number was over a third. And given the sensitivity of that question, I would speculate that the real number could even be higher.
And on that, I guess this is one of those like back of the napkin cheat sheet type things, a little nugget for everyone here who may not be so familiar. If you're starting out with your first influencer campaign or you're just not too familiar, where should I go as a brand
Mhm.
to find the most up-to-date regulations so I know that I'm disclosing and doing the right things?
Well, we're really lucky in this country, in the US, that the FTC has done a wonderful job, including very detailed FAQs, even a couple of live Twitter chats around this very topic. So if you go to the FTC website and look at sponsored content as a subcategory, you'll find a plethora of information. I'd also suggest that the ANA's Word of Mouth Marketing Association, or WOMA, is a wonderful place to be able to get even more detail. In Canada, the ASC, the Ad Standards Council, has really taken a lot of the great learnings from both the US and the UK and applied it. But Danny, the truth of it is that it's really, really simple at the end of the day. And it all comes down to the definition of compensation. And this is where most people get caught up. The compensation in almost all of these countries that I've described is defined as, of course, cash, a product or service. Those are pretty apparent. Then the other things, experiences that aren't readily available to the public, discounts that aren't available to everyone, or other kinds of incentives deemed to be directly correlated to the creation of content that is not asked to the general public. Those are really the 5 types of things that is defined as compensation. And if it's compensated, it needs to be disclosed. And the disclosure doesn't have to be something ridiculously hokey. It just needs to be apparent to the average person, that they know that this was something that was a compensated engagement. So you'll see on short form mediums a hashtag ad or hashtag sponsor that's very prevalent, but you just as easily could incorporate great copy as, this post brought to you by my friends at Starbucks, right?
Yep.
It doesn't have to be a long drawn out thing that discloses what you were paid or how you were paid it. That's not important to any of these bodies. It's that the average consumer would understand a difference between an organic post for being a fanboy or a fangirl and something that was inorganic.
Yep. Yeah, and obviously, in my time spent at IZEA, I think one of those things that we can all agree about is when you find a sponsorship that makes sense for both the brand and the creator, it feels organic. No one is really offended by the suggestions they make because they align with their audience's lifestyle. So it's something that as a brand you shouldn't shy away from, because the negative aspects of a poor partnership, or even more so not disclosing that partnership, are way worse than just doing it the right way the first time.
You hit it on the head, and I say thankfully on purpose. Thankfully, the enforcement actions have ramped up in all of the major ad markets around the world, and as a leader, we are in 110% support. I wish there was frankly more, because there are far more people doing it right than doing it wrong. It's just that the ones that do it wrong do it really wrong.
Most certainly. I want to loop back to something we were talking about earlier, because this is a question that I think if we have some starters and founders on here listening to this, that you have pretty unique knowledge around, is how to manage merging cultures
Mm.
when acquisitions and mergers happen, especially something as dynamic as international expansion, and even just the difference between like a West Coast and an East Coast team or a Canadian team. How do you manage, all those different dynamics that go into the M&A process?
Sure. I think that the Harvard Business School or the McKinsey answer is all about quadrants and spreadsheets and process driven decision making, and that's probably not wrong. I would just volunteer the idea that it's not the entirety of the solution. And from my chair, the way I've always tried to approach it is with the perspective of some humility, because it's really easy to get on a power trip when you're the buyer. I've been in my career mostly a buyer, but also a seller, and it's hard to understand just the very rational emotions that people who are joining a company are feeling. Even if it's financially lucrative for them, there is both a feeling of loss and of gain emotionally. There's certainly the feelings of change and uncertainty. And then there's just the what I call first day of school syndrome of the deal's closed and now what the heck do you do, right?
Yep. What outfit do you wear?
Yeah, like what is acceptable? Like you wear button downs or is it a t-shirt and board shorts place? Like, what's the pecking order of when people talk? Like just what are the social norms? And one of the things that a mentor of mine coached me on decades ago was kind of ignoring the buzz term of culture and instead focusing on the phrase belief system. Because, her point was culture can be thrown around as a convenience word for a lot of organization and that a lot of organizations and frankly when push comes to shove culture is sometimes the first thing that's thrown out of the equation. And it became really apparent to me. And there's a great quote from John Stewart that I have printed out actually right down beneath my monitor here that says, if you don't stick to your values when they're being tested, they're not values, they're hobbies. And so one of the things that I learned and what we've tried to apply at IZEA is talking about our belief system. And some of it is common sense or simplistic in terms of like we are our culture of urgency. We really believe in communicating with purpose and being accountable and getting back to people quickly, both internally and externally. And you have a common and mutual respect. It's unspoken, thankfully, but it's definitely implied. And when that trust is broken, that is something that is a fissure in our belief system, as an example, to bigger things about, hey, we really believe in the expression of many ideas and that we're all trying to fight for the best possible outcome. So realizing that whether it's my opinion as the COO or someone who's just started with us as a junior associate, that we're trying to get the best ideas forward. It's not always elegant. I'll be the first one to admit it. But I think, starting with a standpoint of saying that it's not a hierarchical system of just we're going to all do this and only, play from the same playbook and that's the end of the story is really a failure in a belief system.
Yep.
Now, when you take it to a different level and you talk about, different languages and different geographical cultures, forget corporate cultures for a second, it adds a level of complexity that you can't even begin to imagine because I don't know about you, but I don't speak 5 languages. So
I speak 1.5.
So they're thankfully, and this is a very American way of looking at it, but English is a very common business language, thankfully on a global basis. But you still want to show effort, and most of all, having empathy and understanding for the inherent disconnects that come with a global economy. And some of those are geopolitical too. There's unfortunately a lot of negative stigmas about Americans, for example, in the way that we have expectations, the way we do business. And then you add politics on top of it, it drives the conversation a lot of different directions. So helping people understand that regardless of your politics or your beliefs, that you're aware of those dynamics and that you're not going to let them impede the success of what an initiative is, I think is first and foremost really important to building that trust. There's also the understanding of that you can't possibly know everything. And I know that's a very common business-ism or what have you, but especially on a global basis, I think it's very easy for me to go in and say, look, I'm a business of this size, you're a business of this size. Let me tell you how we've done it, and we're going to throw our system into yours. Well, what you just did by inflicting that onto a business that you just bought is you eliminated all of the best practices in some cases that got them to where you are, to where you wanted to buy it. Yep. So instead of saying, here's how we do it, how you could apply that, it's more of walk me through the thought process of how you landed where you were. Sometimes it's just it's not the best process, and those founders, those operators will be the first to admit it. But in other times, and in my experience, the vast majority of times, you'll pick up gems that are in a corner of the world that can apply to every aspect of your business if you're just willing to listen and not rush through the parts that seem more menial.
So that's one of the things that I've always found the most interesting about you is for how busy you are as a person, for how much you travel, for how much you have on your plate. You're very well read and up to date on all the things going on. You articulate very well your thoughts, and you do an even better job at listening to people first and then speaking second. But from all of that, I'd like to kind of hone in on your ability to ingest all the information in terms of what's going on around in the industry with all that on your plate. How do you manage to do that? Because I think that's something that we all struggle with.
Gosh, with age, it's gotten a lot less effective than it used to be. But truly, there is a method to the madness, and the method is, one part time management, and also one part my own personal belief system, which is, I realized a long time ago that part of my personal satisfaction is, of course, drawn by my professional success or success and failures, I'd also point out, but that a big part of that success or failure, in terms of how I measured it for myself, was the intellectual stimulation along the way, whether it was a successful outcome or a failure of an outcome. And for me, that's about ingesting tremendous amounts of not only data, because I think we are inevitably becoming more and more of a data-driven society overall. Business is just a leading indicator of that. But I really like to be a sponge of perspective, because perspectives are what makes us human and what makes us followable and what makes us frankly exposed sometimes. And the very wisest people I've ever met, people who are exponentially successful, more than the average executive, they are sponges of perspective. And it's not just wisdom from time, it's not just opinions, it's recognizing the real psychology behind why are people thinking the way they are? How can that be applied to me as an individual helping to lead them? How can that be applied to the enterprise as a benefit to everyone as a part of that team? And if you look at the world in those dimensions, it allows you to really prioritize then your time. I'd much rather be able to sit, whether it's with a client, a partner, a team member, an investor, and listen and understand those perspectives than I ever would necessarily chowing through spreadsheet after spreadsheet of the very same things they may be saying, but quantified in front of me. The qualitative, I'm afraid our society is going to a place where we're discounting that in favor of only the quantitative. And as a result, we're leaving half of the perspective off of the table.
So for people listening to this conversation who are hearing this for the first time and are thinking, wow, but even for those of us who have known this for a while and haven't had the ability to hone that skill, what do you suggest you do to have a better outlook on being receptive to people's different perceptions and understanding why it is they feel the way they do?
I think the first part is breaking the societal habit, or at least the business norm, of communicating with your fingers versus.
You mean like this?
Yeah, my hand gesture is like this. Yes. No, but like,
You're saying it don't to be Italian.
No, it's great. This European mutt is very, very receptive to your hand motions. But I think that we're too quick to hide behind our keyboards, behind our thumbs on our phones, and because we have the ability to respond immediately, it doesn't mean we should use that ability for every single aspect of our communication. And I know this sounds perhaps painfully old school, but one of the things I even have to break myself of, being that I am often in different locales where my team isn't always with me, is that when I am with them, prioritizing that FaceTime. There was a great American Airlines ad campaign from years ago that said, eye contact, the most underrated business asset available. And it was promoting, flying to places to take meetings. But I think that holds true in an office environment where, because we have all these forms of rapid communication, I love Slack. I'm still a big inbox guy for email. However, I try to make an effort in any case I can to have that important face time. And when I'm there, I'm actually there. I turn off my computer, I mute my phone, and I look at someone and make that eye contact, because it may sound very corny or cheesy, but you can read a lot about people's feelings and how they're couching their thoughts just by studying their facial reactions. And then from there, once you read that, I think you can have a much more informed conversation about thought process and debating facts, because people fundamentally, at the end of the day, we all as humans want to feel like we're being heard. And we disagree on more things than we agree about just in general and in life, and certainly in business. But if there is a foundational element of being heard and having the trust that you can be heard, even though you may not be agreed with, I think that gets you 85% the way there in terms of how you work with people. The other 15% is hard fought. It's hard fought on fundamentals sometimes. That's where the quantitative definitely comes into the equation. But it's breaking that habit, or that knee-jerk reaction that's there of, hey, let me just quickly iMessage Danny back, with what my thoughts are. It's like, actually, this is important enough where we should talk about this, because even the inflection of his voice could shape the way I interpret that feedback. The way he's sitting in that chair might tell me something that I would otherwise not know if I wasn't in front of him. And that's the basics of how I think about running my day.
Yeah, this wasn't necessarily the direction that I thought this was going to go, and this is probably one of my favorite things that happens out of these is just going wherever the wind takes you. But
Sure.
I'm glad that you have talked about this aspect, because in the time where I reported to you, I think that was probably your strongest asset, was managing emotions and reading the underthoughts and the underlying feelings behind conversations, and being able to respond effectively, regardless of how hostile or whatever the situation may be. You always seem to have a good grasp on what someone's feeling, but also the appropriate way to respond, which is really, really hard to find. And I feel like a lot of us might feel hard to sharpen that skill in your tool set as well. I kind of have just two more questions left, but are there
Yeah.
any things that you've read, and this isn't one of those questions, so two others beside this one. Is there anything that you've read that you would really suggest to people to help them become a better manager?
Oh, to be a better manager. As you know, I read a ton of managerial leadership books, and I think highly of a number of writers. But some of the best wisdom that I've received, and again, this might be me having been born in the wrong era, I'm increasingly finding older and older points of inspiration, both inside of advertising and marketing and outside of it. Most recently, Lou Wonderman passed away. He was the founder of the Wonderman Agency, which then was bought by WPP. And he had all these great isms, these slogans that you can literally put on a wall. And you can almost see him sitting there in an office, smoking a cigarette in the late 50s. And, but the basis of what he was trying to say, not just about advertising, but really how we communicate as people, I find today in 2019 to be truly profound. And there were a bunch of great quotes very recently on his passing, which happened during the week of CES, that were floating around Twitter and over on LinkedIn. And if you have a chance, go search some of those out, because it talks about really how to lead, how brands should fundamentally think about the exchange of trust that happens between them and their customers. And ultimately, as marketers, who I know a lot of them are probably hopefully listening to this podcast or watching this video, it talks about what our role is in all of that. And it has, he had no way of knowing at that time all the different platforms and tactics that we could apply here today in the modern world. But if you were to remove the date on which he said those things or when he wrote those things, you would be just as salient here in January 2019.
Yeah.
I also think that there's so many great books around living the brand that you work for. I've never had the pleasure of being a founder, or some founders might say the torture of being a founder. um, but I've really always not just believed in, but I've fought tooth and nail for the companies and the brands that I've represented. And that was a conscious decision that was brought to me by books like It's Not What You Sell, It's What You Stand For, right? That, focused on this fundamental that in the end, business is about relationships, of course, duh, but it's also that uncomfortable intersection of what people call friendships and what people call business relationships, and understanding that all of it lives in the gray. And one of the greatest joys of my career, whether it's former colleagues, current or former clients, the fact that you almost build this fraternity that lasts decades and can really last a lifetime of people who have inspired you, people who have challenged you, and people who have coached you or taught you things they didn't realize necessarily they were teaching you at the time. Those folks, I think, are the ones that are really powerful, and books that hone in on that. Again, not necessarily the HBS kind of stuff, but the soft skills, I think, are not only critical to leadership, they're critical for us just to understand each other as human beings, no matter what level of management you're in or how big your company might be.
Yeah, that last piece about living the values of the brand. I recently finished Ray Dalio's Principles, and that was a pretty eye-opening one in terms of having, you actually mentioned this in passing earlier in our conversation, having your own values laid out so you understand what it is that you stand for, so that you know that you can align yourself with whomever it is that you want to work for. And I think only until very recently did I stumble upon that thought process, and it really does add a lot of clarity when you start to think about what is it that I want to represent, and then you can align yourself with that. So it's interesting.
Well, I'm a big Disney fan, and the late Roy E. Disney, Walt's brother, used to say it's not hard to make decisions once you know what your values are, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what you value as an individual. And I've certainly made plenty of mistakes. But one of the things that you learn when you make those mistakes, either as a leader or as a team member or just as a in my case, a dad or a husband, is that there is a value to the power of perseverance and of grit. And the last shameless plug I would give for a book and an author to that point is Angela Duckworth. I think her book on grit.
It's amazing.
I think I've shared it with you.
It's incredible.
Is really and truly one of the more powerful reads that I think leaders of all shapes and sizes can benefit from.
Yeah, it's a very good one. I think it was you who introduced me to that, and that was an incredible read. I think I have like 20 books on my bookshelf from you mentioning it. I'm like, hold on, finish that conversation while I type this down.
The Ryan Schram Lending Library at IZEA HQ continues to grow, by the way, for people who want to come and visit.
I'm glad. I hope you read some of the ones I put on your shelf. Maybe next time I come visit, I'll confirm whether you have. I had two more. I've been trying to keep these short, but every time I talk to you, I feel like I just have a million questions and I could go on forever. The two that I have remaining, one I was going to kill, but since you mentioned Disney, I was going to ask you what's the funniest story of your professional career, but instead I prefer to ask you, what is your favorite Disney movie?
So I think that I had to couch my response with pre or post Pixar acquisition. So I think that the art of creativity and the story of Pixar is just such an incredible piece of frankly history, and each one of their films has been so interesting from a character development and plot perspective unto itself. But if I had to go classic Disney, I would actually choose one live action and one animation. The animation one is probably
before long. You're gonna break this down to 16 different sectors. You're gonna name every Disney movie.
Well, I literally have an entire shelf of books that can break down the entire history of all this. But I'll pick probably a less popular one or a less apparent one, which is Fantasia. Fantasia was really Walt's opus to him as an artist. And it also, kind of a head nod to what you and I do, was also for its time one of the most technologically sophisticated films ever made, animation or otherwise. It debuted the idea of stereophonic sound being put into theaters. The idea that literally, the Met was playing the soundtrack to something that had a palette and a richness to the storytelling that no one had ever seen before from animation. It changed things. But then, on the very other end of the scale, probably equally powerful, but very different, is that of Mary Poppins. And whether it's the performance of Julie Andrews or Dick Van Dyke, or my very favorite, which is the dancing penguins in the animation sequence during Jolly Holiday, that was also one of those interesting examples, and frankly the brilliance of Walt Disney to realize that you take this Travers book that was kind of this obscure British story, and you brought it into the American market to be made, and do it in such a way that the world never seen anything like that before. Someone jumping in to a chalk painting and having the biggest stars of the day singing along with animated characters not only pushed the envelope, it moved the envelope to a different zip code, right? I mean, it was unbelievable. And I don't know if you've seen Mary Poppins Returns, but it's a really nice homage to the original. And in my opinion, Emily Blunt was robbed by not getting an Oscar nomination yesterday morning, but that's a whole other topic.
I haven't seen. I'll have to see it now. And of course, there's like the perfect amount of explanation I would expect from such a movie buff like yourself.
Gotta make sure I get into
You do the
qualification of what my favorites are there.
In case someone was gonna watch this video and go, I don't agree with that. Why does he feel the way that he feels?
You can debate me at Ryan Schram on Twitter.
Oh, I bet you there's gonna be some people who will. And then my last question for you, that I think is one of the more interesting ones that I get across the board is, as an organization, it could either be specific to your marketing department or as an organization as a whole. What do you feel the biggest challenge that you face is?
I think that from a B2B perspective, our customers obviously are brands themselves, agencies, large media companies. The problem ultimately is that the increase in tactics in the B2B marketing realm has actually created almost too much noise in the channel. And as a result, I'm starting to feel, and maybe you are too, this whiplash that's happening where all of the tactics that worked even 18 months ago are not necessarily working as well as they once did. And it runs the gamut, digital and, by the way, in person. It used to be like these great big marketing confabs were the way to go. You'd sponsor those, you'd speak at those. They'd be great for driving leads and building relationships. And now, because there was one great conference, there's 50, and you fragmented the heck out of it, right? And suddenly, and no offense to the people who go to those, the caliber has plummeted as a result. None of them are good anymore, right? So you took something that was great, and by really saturating it, we made it awful. And it's actually put some of the better ones out of business because all those new entrants were trying to steal sponsorship and attendee dollars, and it actually hurt the ones that were of quality.
Yep.
And the same goes down the line when you look at paid tactics and other forms of platforms. The fact of the matter is that as individual employees, we don't want to be marketed to, right? We are also human that way. And I always look at these things in the filter of, if I was receiving them as someone trying to pitch me, how would I want someone to reach out to me? And I think it's why we talked about this earlier. Platforms like LinkedIn continue to be so undervalued. It's one of the truly safe places in the business technology ecosystem where you can have that trusted advisor kind of mentality to be marketed toward, and it's not as offensive because unfortunately marketing automation has come to a point where email is now just a complete echo box of spam. To a lesser extent, entire companies now are going with soft phones. They don't have desk phones. They don't answer them. They don't listen to their voicemails. So the old days of dialing and smiling really don't exist for most categories. And more and more with ad blocking, the ability, you might be able to build an audience programmatically, but that ad may never be seen by your recipient. And how much waste is there in the middle?
Yeah.
So this might be self-serving, but I still believe it's why content and quality content is king. It's the reason why we've invested so much in sponsoring independent research that can be used as a door opener and to build credibility and demonstrate our thought leadership. It's the very reason why we've tried to build our own events that aren't necessarily intended for the industry; they're intended for our customers. And frankly, it's the reason why I think that from a searchability perspective, particularly as we look at the impact of voice-based search, VSEO is going to be a whole new world that not many people are prepared for because all of the assets they've built before were geared for a typed in answer or question.
Yeah.
And now, things that would have been in answer boxes and other kinds of forms of shorter form answers need to be in the proper inflection and intonation for natural language processing to understand them and for systems to be able to index them.
Yeah, and I can't echo that same sentiment any more than you just did because it's true. And I think part of the underlying reason for this, video series in general is to understand the people who are on top of their game, seeing everything that's working and not working and being able to reflect on where they're finding their wins because as you mentioned, it's a struggle now, right? You see the resurgence of traditional channels because it's one of the few that's been neglected long enough to come back in relevance.
Yeah, that's right. That's absolutely right.
And then everything that hasn't been is just a mess. But again, I really appreciate all the insights as always. This has been super great catching up with you. If you guys aren't familiar with IZEA, definitely check them out. Is it still called the State of the Creator Economy?
It sure is. The 2018 copy is on our website, available for download for free.
Check out the State of the Creator Economy. It has all of the metrics that Ryan has mentioned in here in terms of people understanding disclosure, rates, all that good stuff. I feel like it's 200 pages long of amazing information and data that they sampled from their users. So check that out. Check out IZEA for influencer and custom content. And thank you so much for your time, Ryan. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Danny. Always great to be here.
Talk to you soon, pal. Bye.